Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Todd Coons, and if you haven't been here before, welcome. Thank you for showing up. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. And as you can see, today we're going to talk about weddings. And we're going to talk about weddings with a specific camera. My favorite camera that if you watch this channel, you know I love this camera. It's the Fuji X100V. And I'm going to talk today about why this is a fabulous wedding camera. Okay, so first thing I like to do whenever I talk about something like this or I kind of review something, number one, I'm not a review channel. I have no desire to go out and get the latest, greatest cameras, talk about them, but I'm very willing to talk about the gear that I use, tell you why I use the gear I use, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, and how I put it to use as a professional photographer. I also want to take a quick second because I know the channel's still small and a lot of you may be watching this, you've never seen me before. I want to do a little bit of a disclaimer as to who I am, just to give a little bit of credibility as to why you should be listening to me and why my opinion means anything. Because as we all know, there's a lot of people on YouTube reviewing gear that, they just don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so very quickly, since we're talking about weddings today, I have been a professional photographer for over 30 years. But for about 7 years of that 30 years, I was a full-time wedding photographer. I did a lot of other things too, but weddings took up about 90% of what I did. We did about 50 weddings a year. Once I left the wedding industry full-time, I started teaching college. I taught wedding photography in college. During that time, I continued to do weddings. I still do weddings to this day. When I was teaching, I was doing maybe 15 weddings a year. Today, I do commercial photography, and this year I have 2 weddings on the books. So I don't do weddings full-time anymore, but I did do it for quite a while, and I've probably shot about 400 to 500 weddings. I stopped counting at some point. It just got a little ridiculous, but I have done a lot of weddings. I've done big ones, I've done small ones, I've been in, exotic places, and I've been at the VFW. So I've done a little bit of everything, and, they're all great. If you are in the wedding industry, you either love it or you hate it, and if you're in it full-time, my advice is you should probably love doing it. And I had a passion for the couples and just enjoyed it. Okay, so let's get down to what this video is all about, and that is shooting weddings with the X100. If you don't know much about this camera is made by Fuji. It is an APS-C size sensor. It's got a 23mm lens, fixed focal length lens. You can't change the lens. And this camera, if you do any research on it whatsoever, this camera's claim to fame is a fantastic street camera. People who go out on the street, do everyday life, journalistic, spontaneous type photographs, love this camera. It's small, it's fast, it's quiet, it's very discreet. It's not some big ominous camera that you put in somebody's face and they get uncomfortable with it. So for street photography, it's a dream. I bought it as a stock photography camera. I wanted to have a camera that I could take anywhere. But between what I was doing with it and what everybody was talking about as far as it being a great street camera, it just dawned on me it's the perfect wedding camera. I mean, after all, what is a wedding? It is chasing people around, documenting the events as they happen and being spontaneous and not being obtrusive or in the way, but being subtle and, kind of a fly on the wall and documenting a wedding day. Now, before I go any farther, I want to say this. I don't have any video of me actually using this at a wedding, but I have a lot of examples from weddings that I've shot with this. I've actually shot 3 weddings with it now, so I'm going to run a bunch of examples as I'm talking to give you an idea of what I did with the camera at a wedding, but unfortunately I don't have actual footage of me doing it, so I apologize for that. Now, like I said, it's small, it's fast, it's unobtrusive. Nobody's going to look at this and think, why are you sticking that big camera in my face? But I do want to talk about something that I think is absolutely true, and that's the image or the perception that people are going to have of you when you walk in the door with a camera like this. Wedding photography is dealing with what I always have called the general public. You're not necessarily dealing with an educated client as far as somebody who knows a great deal about photography. They just know they like pretty pictures, and if the bride is smiling and she's in focus and you got Aunt June in the photo and you didn't forget Uncle Fred, then they're thrilled. But that type of a client, sometimes when you walk in with a huge camera with a big light and everything, then they think or there at least the perception is there that this guy must know what he's talking about. So that being the case, one of my initial thoughts, what are they going to think when I walk in with this little tiny camera? And it's small, definitely. But out of 3 weddings where I've taken this camera out and used it, I've only gotten one comment, and that was somebody came up to me and said, "Is that a film camera?" So I guess my conclusion after 3 weddings is the size of this camera hasn't been a red flag to anybody. Nobody's even stopped and looked at it funny. The one comment I got was just, was it a film camera? So not only image is everything and perception of what the camera looks like is important, but the image quality. I'm not going to go into all the specs of the camera and all the ins and outs of that, but what I have found is the image quality coming out of this, I believe it's a 26 megapixel camera, is fantastic. Even at higher ISOs, which, you know, if you're a wedding shooter, you're going to be in dark rooms at different times. The higher ISOs, it performs really well. I don't personally like to go over 3200, and I don't go there unless I have to, but when I have had to go to a higher ISO, no problems. The images are beautiful, you know, and as far as wedding photography is, you know, every photographer is probably different. I don't make a ton of huge prints. You know, album quality prints, no problem whatsoever. You're going to be thrilled with the quality coming out of this camera. Let me add this little thing about image quality. This lens has an f2 on it. It's the widest aperture it has is f2. Even at f2, I have not found that this lens is not tack sharp. If it's not tack sharp, I know it's probably my fault, not the lens's fault. Even at close in subjects, no problem focusing, even at f2. And if you're the kind of photographer that loves to throw the backgrounds way out of focus, and you're thinking, well, it's not a full frame, I can't do that, that's bogus. F2, you can throw the backgrounds out of focus pretty easily, unless you're somebody that just likes it so blitzed out that, you know, I don't know. That's not my kind of shooting, so I don't have any problems with the APS-C and the depth of field, and sharpness is on point. One of the things I got to talk about for sure is battery life. It doesn't come with a very big battery, and, you know, some of the things I've read, you know, the battery life is not great. So when I took it to a wedding for the very first time, I was a little concerned, because if you're going to go hours on end, you know, and the battery runs out, that's a problem. The first wedding that I shot, I only had one battery for it, so I knew it was not going to be my main camera all day long, because I knew if the battery goes dead, I'm done. So it was a secondary camera in the first wedding. The other thing was the wedding was outside. It was also very cold that day. It was in October, and I was in Ohio, and the battery did die on me fairly quickly. I can't remember how many shots I took at that wedding, but by the time the ceremony was over, my battery was about dead. So the next wedding I went to, I had a second backup battery. So the wedding number 2 and 3, I had a backup battery. But the other thing that I did was I turned the LCD screen off. So typically I have the LCD screen on. If I put my eye up to the viewfinder, the LCD screen goes off. That's usually how I shoot with it. But at the weddings, I turned that off, so I have to look through the viewfinder. In the next 2 weddings that I shot with the LCD screen off, I didn't even get through the first battery. So I think that as long as you leave the LCD screen off, battery life is not going to be a problem. If you love to have the LCD screen on, I suggest you're going to have at least 2 or 3 batteries, and you know, once that first battery comes out, you put the second battery in, you've got that first battery on a charger charging up so that you're good to go. I didn't have a problem turning the LCD screen off, and the battery life became a non-issue. So one thing I got to talk about with this camera, and I've talked about it before on this channel, but when it comes to the weddings, it's absolutely something we got to talk about, and that is the fact that the lens on this camera is a fixed focal length lens. You cannot change the lens. It's not a zoom lens. 23 millimeters on an APS-C size sensor is kind of a mid-range wide-angle lens, and my initial thoughts on that lens is I find it to be a benefit. The fact that I don't have a choice, this is the lens you get. You can't zoom in and out. You can't change it. You are forced to move in and out, compose the shot with your feet, so to speak, and get in there and get the shot you want. I like that. It's a motivator to me, and it makes me, essentially it kind of makes me a better photographer, because I'm having to work at it a little bit rather than just that old zoom lens that I used to have that, you know, I could just zoom in and out and stand in one place. In that regard, I like it. However, there are certainly drawbacks to having only one lens. If you're a wedding photographer, you know there are times when you get in these small spaces that a really wide-angle lens is very, very helpful, if not essential. Maybe the bride's room where they're all getting ready, it's a very tight room, or the guys are, you know, they got stuck in some closet to get ready. Certainly there are reception sites that aren't very big and you're trying to take these wide shots of a lot of people, and that is a problem because you can only back up so much in a lot of cases. So there's a little bit of a drawback to the super wide that you sometimes will need. You also don't have a long lens, and there are certainly times at a wedding where you might want a more telephoto lens. Maybe you want to compress the background, or you want to zoom in tight on some hands during the ceremony. So there are some limitations with the lens, and you know, I don't have an excuse for that. That is the way that is, and if you only use this camera at a wedding, you'd have to work around that, and it would be a challenge sometimes for sure. If you shoot weddings, you know you are never going to be able to get away and photograph every single wedding without using a flash at some point. You're either in a dark reception hall, or the lighting is weird, or something. At some point, you're going to need a flash. I happen to have two of these Godox speed lights. I've always used speed lights at a wedding, by and large. This is an amazing light. Someday we'll have to talk about this light. I really, really like it. And although this is a perfect light for a wedding, here's a little bit of a drawback when it comes to using it with the X100. If you put this guy on here, the flash is as big as the camera. I find that a little bit awkward as far as holding it. The other thing with this flash, it's got a tiny bit of a wobble on my X100. It doesn't have it on my X-T4, but for some reason it does on this. This I find a little awkward, although it works fabulously. I'll show some reception images that I shot with this setup, and they looked fine. They're beautiful, but it's a little clunky and it's a little big. I found myself walking around holding it like this, take the picture, walk around a little more like this, take the picture. So it works, but it's a little clunky with a flash this size. The other thing, and I don't know if you guys can see this, it kind of gets in the way of the shutter speed dial, and I found myself trying to look at it to change the shutter speed when I first got started at the reception the other day, and it's a little weird to see. So that's not a big deal, but it's a little awkward. Now, one of the things I do with my speed lights, I do have a trigger so that I can have the light off camera somewhere on a stand. Putting the trigger on this camera, much more user friendly, and it's not top heavy. It's not in the way of that shutter speed dial. I can see what I'm doing. This might be the way I would go and always keep the flashes off camera. Problem with that is I probably need somebody that's got the light on a pole or something that can be moving for me. You're not going to be able to put the light on a stand and just leave it in the corner, and you know, there's too many things moving and they happen over here and then there, and you need the light going with you. So this is a very convenient thing, works super well, but it's got its limits as well. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to talk about as far as the mechanics of the camera that makes this a fabulous wedding camera is that it has a leaf shutter. Now, I've talked about the leaf shutter before. In a nutshell, just very simple, a leaf shutter allows you to take flash photos at any shutter speed. So I can be at 1,000th of a second using the flash, and the flash will sync with my camera without having to use high-speed sync or anything crazy like that, because high-speed sync, although it's an amazing technology, it's got some limits to it. So the leaf shutter is vastly important, just because if you're in bright sunlight or a bright day, you may still want to use the flash, and that is going to allow you to do that much more successfully than a focal plane shutter. So guys, overall, the Fuji X100V, is it a good wedding camera? Yeah, I think it's a fantastic wedding camera. I will continue to use it as a wedding camera whenever I happen to shoot a wedding. Would love to shoot an entire wedding with it someday. Haven't quite done that yet. If you know somebody that's getting married and would be willing to trade out the fact that I'm going to only use this camera, you know, I might be willing to make a really good deal on something like that. So if you know somebody, have them get in contact with me. we'll make it work. If I was going to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to say an 8. The only reason I'm not going to give it higher is because of the fixed focal length lens, which I did say is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does have a little bit of a drawback to it, because there are going to be times, especially on the wide end, at least I've found, that you're going to need something wider and you're just going to be in this tight little space, that this is going to be a little bit of a drawback. But other than that, love it. Would do it again. Like I said, I want to shoot a whole wedding with it. Alright guys, thanks as always for your comments. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed already, be thinking about that. We're getting really close to that 500 mark. Leave a thumbs up if you would. And like I said, if you have a comment, leave it. If you got a question, leave it. Love talking to you guys. And if you have an X100V, if you're a wedding shooter, if you've done both, I'd love to hear about that and get your thoughts. And I will see you guys in the next video.